Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2018 Hack Summit. We are on day 2. Day 1 was an incredible opportunity for us to learn about blockchain. We had some fantastic speakers, and day 2 is going to be even better. And we're kicking it off with my good friend Riccardo Fluffy Pony Spagni, who's a lead maintainer of the Monero project. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Monero, Monero is ranked as the 12th biggest cryptocurrency in the world with a market cap of $2 billion as of today. So it's an enormous responsibility that Riccardo has shouldered over the past few years, helping spearhead that initiative. And we're very grateful to have him here to help support these nonprofits in the software development space. So Riccardo, thanks for being here today.
Very much for having me.
Great. So audience, this is going to be a free-flowing fireside chat between myself and Riccardo. And if you have questions for Fluffy Pony, you can feel free to ask them. At the bottom of your screen, there's an Ask a Question button. So just feel free to chime in and ask any questions. And other audience members can upvote your questions. And that way we can democratically rise the best questions to the top, just like it should be done on the blockchain. And
voting on the blockchain, or is it centralized? Because I don't know if we can participate if it's centralized.
Well, so blockchain technology would actually have to work for that to happen, So that is on our roadmap, Not just teasing you. That we will submit that as a feature request to Crowdcast in the future. So Crowdcast is the technology behind this. And by the way, if you enjoy what you learned today between myself and Riccardo, you can click the donate button at the bottom of your screen to donate Ethereum, Bitcoin, or US dollars to important coding charities. And they're the beneficiaries of this event. And this event basically raises money for charity. We make nothing off this event. We're just doing it to help the social good. And that's why we're so grateful to have Riccardo here as a strong advocate and supporter of those coding nonprofits. So Riccardo, why don't we kick things off by just hearing more about yourself and your background? Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you got into programming originally, what fascinated you about software development, open source, all that stuff. Maybe kick it off from there.
So I've been a developer for most of my life. My earliest exposure to programming was on a Commodore 64. And I remember going to the local library, this is obviously pre-internet, and getting a book that had a bunch of apps and another book that had a bunch of games in. And it was literally all in BASIC, and it was written out line by line. And you had to go and take that and then retype it from the book. Then there was an appendix that would say, if you have a Commodore 64, change this line. And if you have a ZX Spectrum, change these lines. And then invariably you'd spend hours typing this and typing it, and then you'd run it and it wouldn't work. And so I had this amazing introduction to debugging at probably the worst environment ever, where you've got no visibility of your code. You have to list the code, and then the code's too long to fit in the screen. So then you have to list lines 10 to 100, and then you checking them one at a time till you eventually go, oh, I accidentally did something on line 50, and that's what broke it. So having that early exposure to debugging in that horrible environment, and then also the joy of problem solving, I think really shaped a lot of my views and a lot of the way I approach things. I embrace problem solving. It's almost like a drug, you just get involved and then you solve this problem and you're like, whoa, it worked. And there's this rush of adrenaline and endorphins at the same time. And I think that's what a lot of developers live for. That's what a lot of programmers live for. At any rate, post school, I studied and part-time and worked because I felt that I needed to gain experience whilst I was studying. And eventually worked my way up to quite a senior position at a listed company here in South Africa. Quit that to start my own company with my wife. We started an import-export business, and I wrote all the back-end systems for that and the front-end systems too. And that became quite successful, and it led to giving me enough free time to discover Bitcoin. So discovered Bitcoin early 2011, really got stuck into it. At the beginning, I was very critical, and so I got stuck into it from that perspective. Did a bit of mining, and then eventually realized that I didn't really want to do mining. What I wanted to do was build tools for miners, so sort of be the guy providing shovels and pickaxes. So I did a lot of that, and eventually designed and sold a flat, packable, stackable open air frame for mining GPU mining rigs, and that did really well. That was 2013, and then discovered Monero early 2014. Got involved with that, and I've been the lead maintainer for the last few years, and I'm hoping to hand over the lead maintainer role in the next, sort of 12 to or 6 to 18 months.
That's a great story. It's funny. You and I had the same story, because when I first started out programming, I had this ancient machine called a ZX81, which plugged into your TV. And I remember literally buying a book that had basic code in it and literally by hand writing that basic code into this machine, and it wouldn't work. And eventually, after trial and error, I created a chessboard, which was non-functioning. It was just a picture of a chessboard. And I was so proud of myself, for actually coding something that was kind of like a game. And that's kind of how I got into programming, and that's how a lot of developers get into, is because of games and things like that. And it's crazy to see how things have evolved, from those humble beginnings. And by the way, before we go on, I want to do a shout out to your background. So that is a pretty awesome environment that you're in. I'm not sure where that is. Are you in a wine cellar? And is it kind of like a neon glow in the dark wine cellar? Like what's the story behind that?
No, this is actually in my house, and I have the display behind me. And it's got LED strips behind that change color. They don't really vent a lot of heat, so they don't damage the wine. But I think it's a pretty cool display, and I like to have it as a backdrop whenever I do live shows.
That's great. And is that legit wine there? Like, is it drinkable?
Legit wine. It's a lot of older wines where I probably wouldn't have opened them anyway. Most of them are old and have corked, and there's some newer ones as well. But typically, if I'm taking a wine to drink, I'm taking it from like the cellar and not from here. This is more of a display.
That's very convenient. So if we get too serious in our conversation today, we can just grab a bottle of wine from the back and drink it. Right?
Like, what's the time there by you? That's perfectly fine to drink in the morning, right?
It's like 9 a.m. Pacific. Yeah, day drinking is totally acceptable.
It's a little bit of wine with your breakfast.
Exactly. Very cool. So let's talk a little bit more about kind of the engineering leadership role that you have at Monero. So you're hands-on as a software developer, but you're also an advocate and a leader. And how do you balance those two? I mean, I'm sure that it kind of pulls at you to have multiple roles here, especially with the new projects that you're undertaking. So how do you balance leadership with actual contributions?
Good question. I think one of the things that is frustrating about open source is contributors typically want to just contribute. And, as a contributor myself, that's kind of all I want to do. But there's lots of fiddly bits, there's reviewing pull requests, and there's, releases, and dealing with the build bot isn't working anymore for this operating system. And lots of, I guess, herding cats, this particular pull request doesn't have tests. No problem, we're going to merge it, but then someone needs to write tests for it. And you're in this weird role where you're nobody's boss. So you can't be like, oh, why did you do this? You messed up. Or, please go and write this for me or whatever. You've got to you've got to identify what's gone wrong and what needs to happen there. And everyone's pretty self-directed. So, you can make suggestions to people, but you can't force them to do anything. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of like this weird, almost administrative role that I've ended up in, where I've progressively just done less and less coding and focused more on herding cats and administrative stuff and code reviews. Open source, especially stuff that is as sensitive as Monero, really lives and dies by who's reviewing the pull requests. And so I've had to do more of that than anything else.
And how do you decide who reviews those pull requests? Is there a committee for that? How does the governance work for accepting these improvements?
So typically, the way it works with, and I mean, this varies obviously from project to project. With Monero, we use a form of something called C4, which is the Collaborative Code Construction Contract, and it's basically like a contributor agreement that is used in 0MQ. and it's been used by ZeroMQ very successfully for many years. So we have a fork of it, and we apply many of the principles. And one of the principles is that we will kind of merge any pull request as long as it passes a review by one or two known contributors. So as long as they're known contributors, they've been around for a while, and they approve the pull request, then there's really no reason not to merge it. Unless it's like obviously bad or obviously trying to break things. But typically, even if it's something that's done in a way that is slightly different to the way that we would like or that I might like, I think it's better to give people an opportunity to get their pull request in and then correct it thereafter as they learn, rather than try and force people into please go and read these thousands of contributor documents just so that you can get your first pull request submitted, which corrects a spelling error on one line.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of like the trade-off between should you read a lofty manual before actually building a software project versus just getting involved, looking at code, looking at examples, modifying the examples. That second learning style tends to be a little bit more efficient for a lot of people.
I think it's like having a committee and doing all of that works for some software projects, open source software projects. Apache is famously leaned heavily on things like loose consensus, which is what we're largely governed by. Whereas there's certain other software projects like Debian and so on that lean more towards a more formal committee that does this and does that and does the other. And I think that whatever your governance structure, as long as it's something that works in open source, not really a big deal. I mean, you've of course got Linux, which has a benevolent dictator, and benevolent dictators in open source are great. The problem is that the traditional open source governance structures are often not a great idea when it comes to cryptocurrency, because obviously there's legal and regulatory risk if you are, Bob who launched his own cryptocurrency.
Yeah, I mean, there's money at stake now, or crypto money at stake at least, right? So how do you deal with that? How have you grappled with those regulatory challenges for your project?
With it is really just to be as hands-off as possible. There's no central cabal. There's no group that controls everything. Everything's extremely self-organizing. So if you've ever been to DEF CON or CCC or any conferences like that, you'll understand what self-organizing means. At CCC, for example, you can be like, well, I want to have a little stall, and my stall is about learning Klingon. And if you get a bunch of people to help you and you set that up and you all come dressed in traditional Klingon garb and you have Klingon conversations the whole day at your stall, no one's going to stop you. You can do whatever you want because that's your passion and you're doing it at a hacker conference, but who cares? That's what you're bringing to the table. And so with Monero, there are things, we use a very similar structure where there are things that people want to accomplish. And so they go and they set up a work group and they get a bunch of people to help them because they want to achieve this thing, whether it is, I don't know, marketing or helping people who have Monero mining malware that's installed in their computer. And they go set up these work groups and they run with them and they do whatever they want. And the development of Monero is also done with work groups. So you've got a work group that focuses on the core Monero software, like the command line stuff, the libraries, that sort of thing. And you've got a group that work on the GUI, and you've got a group that work on the website. And because it's all self-organizing, there's no single entity that's responsible for all of the components or for even a large subset of them.
But there is an approval layer that's from known contributors, correct? And are those known contributors elected, or is it based on their historical contributions that you kind of have an informal system for approving of these? It's
informal based on their historical contributions. So, I mean, a known contributor is someone who's been around for a while and, has a few commits. And again, I mean, it's largely loose consensus. So if somebody submits a pull request and they're like 30 approvals from contributors who've sprung up in the last 6 months, the community is going to go like, whoa, that's weird. Why is that happening? So there's sort of a general order of things. There's a general way that pull requests are managed, and people become very used to that. And it makes it easy to spot the odd ones out, if someone tries to slip a backdoor in.
That makes sense. And so tell us more a little bit about the vision behind Monero. So how was Monero originally created? Who created it, and how did you take over? And what is the vision for Monero both today and in the future?
The origin story is kind of interesting. It was launched in early 2014 by a guy called Thankful for Today. We don't know his real name. It was based on a white paper by another pseudonymous guy, Nicholas van Saberhagen. We also don't know his real name. So you've got like pseudonymous white paper that is now launched or fulfilled in code that is created by pseudonymous creator. And
this is what's amazing about cryptocurrency. You've got like Satoshi, who's also pseudonymous, and it's kind of, I think it fits the developer mentality of developers being humble contributors, not having egos, not wanting credit for their work, right? That's what's amazing about the world we live in.
Oh, absolutely. And so the only difference between Bitcoin Satoshi and Monero Satoshi, who was Thankful for Today, is Monero Satoshi was not that benevolent. I mean, he was at the beginning. So the first few weeks were awesome, and he was just like, making sure that everything was running, and he was like contributing code, and everything was great. And then he wanted Monero to be merge mined with another coin. And
what does that mean, merge mined? Maybe you could define that for the audience.
Sure. So what it means is that instead of Monero having its own security model, its security model would be backed up onto another currency. So it becomes like a side chain instead of being a base layer itself, which is a fantastic thing to do. In fact, we're employing that very model in a new project that I'm building called Tari, where Tari will be merge mined with Monero. But at any rate, the community wanted Monero to be a base layer, to be separate from everything else. And Thankful for Today just that kind of wasn't having it. And he put his foot down and said like, well, I don't care what you guys want. I'm going to do it anyway. And there was this rift between him and the community. And so myself and 6 others, we forked the project away from him. And we ran our own implementation, and the two ran in parallel for a few months. And eventually he just stopped developing his and disappeared. And ours became the de facto implementation.
Very nice. Wow. And so did you start off as kind of the lead maintainer, or was it a slow evolution over time?
It was kind of myself and one of the other guys, Taco Time. We were both merging pull requests. And eventually, like, Taco Time got busy, and so I started to take on more and more of that. And eventually it was just sort of this evolution. I mean, it was pretty quick. Within a few months, it was kind of like just me merging pull requests.
Yep.
And really having to figure it out, because there was, it was a code base that wasn't familiar to me. I was working with people that I didn't know in real life. Like, I knew them online on IRC, and that was it. And it was kind of hairy, it's like you don't know how you're supposed to act, or, how you're going to decide things. Everything is just sort of like designed by, well, we'll just bumble through it and hope we get it right.
Right. That's interesting. And so, there's a good lesson for the audience here is that, Riccardo just got involved. He started helping, contributing, and it organically led to him kind of being in this natural position to be the lead maintainer. So there's a lot of folks in the audience the other day who were asking, how can I make money in open source? How can I become a prominent leader in open source, this and that? And I guess the lesson learned here really is just as you start contributing and as you start adding value, it just becomes organic and natural over time for there to be opportunities for you, because the community will start to look up to you and start to look for guidance naturally. Great. So tell us a little bit more about Monero. So what is the vision behind Monero, and how is it different than other cryptocurrencies?
I mean, again, given its interesting origins, I don't think there there was a lot of thought given to what the future of Monero could be. You know, we were just, I think a lot of people that got involved at the beginning were interested in the technology. We were just amazed by like, oh, look at this amazing pro-privacy thing that could be kind of cool. And so we spent a lot of time, like as a community at the beginning, just sort of being very focused on that, on the privacy aspects. And it's important to understand that Monero isn't based on Bitcoin's code. It's not a fork of Bitcoin. And so it was a brand new code base. It uses different elliptic curves or a different elliptic curve rather, to Bitcoin. There's tons of stuff that is just like massively different to Bitcoin in terms of the way things fit together, programmatically especially. There were no libraries. There was only one implementation and one code base. So there was no like JavaScript library or, you know, bindings for other languages. It was literally like coming in from scratch. There weren't even libraries to like access the RPC calls from other languages. So everything had to be written from scratch, which was equal parts challenging and frustrating. But what it did do is give us a lot of focus as a community on the pro-privacy aspects. And anyone who wasn't heavily interested in the privacy aspects peeled off after a few months, you know, and walked away because they weren't interested enough. The people that stuck it out for years are people that are firm believers in the basic human right to privacy. And I think as a community, we've all become advocates for privacy, or we came into this already advocating for the right to privacy. So that's sort of, I mean, Monero's vision is really just to be maximally privacy preserving, but in a way that allows everyone to use the privacy preserving or the privacy aspects of Monero. It's not designed to be anything more than that, really. And I think in terms of the long-term vision, there are lots of other pro-privacy projects that are getting involved with Monero in one way or another, whether it is simply accepting donations in Monero, or whether it is deeper integration, maybe building on top of Monero, or building in parallel to Monero, as with Kovri and some of the other projects that are part of the Monero ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And tell us more a little bit about the technical architecture behind Monero. So we've got a pretty big engineering audience here, so I think they can hang in there with us over a little bit of a technical conversation. So you mentioned there's some elliptical curve differences with Bitcoin, and maybe some other topics you might want to dive into as to what's behind the hood for Monero.
You know, I mean, there are a bunch of different components. I guess like the simplest component is probably the website, which is Jekyll. We use Jekyll to produce a static website because then we're obviously a target all the time. And if we were running WordPress, it would be pretty embarrassing. We'd probably have been owned long ago. So there's not a lot of like programming stuff that happens on the website, but there is a crowdfunding system that is written in PHP. And that's currently being rewritten, which is kind of exciting. And then, of course, there's the core Monero software, which is all C++ with bits of C scattered around. The C is largely just for the cryptography, but it's primarily C++ for the rest of it. It's not as modular as we would like. It's not as soundly structured as we would like. But we have taken a code base that was, in many ways, pretty shocking at the beginning, largely uncommented. And we have somehow beat it into submission, and we've managed to add comments to pretty much every part of the code base. Functional tests, unit tests, performance tests, all of that's in. So that's pretty nice. And then, of course, you've got the GUI, the GUI. And the GUI is Qt, but it's Qt Quick. So we started dabbling with the GUI in 2014, and Qt Quick was all the rage. And in hindsight, we probably could have done something like either use traditional Qt or done something else. But I'm kind of glad that we ended up going with Qt Quick because it doesn't have the the attack surface of something like Electron, but at the same time, from a design perspective, it's still very like HTML. It's there's a whole markup language behind it, and moving things around and fiddling with it from a design perspective is actually kind of easy. So I think that ultimately ended up being a reasonably good decision in the long run. Also the API and all that, that's part of the GUI is written in C++.
I see. Very nice. And tell us about how maybe Zcash and Monero might compare.
Sure. So Zcash is where Zcash is different to Monero is it is a Bitcoin. So it's based on Bitcoin's code base. And because of that, instead of just taking Bitcoin's code and adding and making all the transactions private, there's actually two different currencies almost in Zcash. You've got like the non-private Zcash and the private Zcash, and you can move in between them. And because of this, a lot of people use the non-private one without realizing that they can move into the private one and back again. And they're sort of just basically then using Bitcoin. And this, of course, has been both advantageous and problematic for Zcash. It's advantageous because it means that they can get onto things a lot easier that already support Bitcoin, because if you support Bitcoin, supporting the non-private version of Zcash is trivial. But then the privacy stuff is because it's non-stand or it's not default and it's kind of power hungry. Very few people end up using it. And what that basically amounts to is you've got this like amazing maximally private technology in Zcash, but no one's using it. And with Monero, we've got pretty strong privacy claims with regards to obscuring the amount and hiding who you're paying. But in terms of like where the transaction comes from, our privacy is weaker than Zcash's. But because more people are using Monero, it's easier to get lost in the crowd.
I see. Okay. And one last question from me before we go to the audience. So, you've got an open source team that's distributed and decentralized, and it's not directly under your control. How is it that you're able to inspire and motivate these folks to continue to actively contribute? I assume every now and then you'll have a contribution that you don't agree with or that you need to reject. And, someone might take it personally if you don't accept their request, right? So how do you motivate a volunteer team where there's no salaries, right? You can't tell people what to do, right? How does that governance model kind of work in an open source world where you're able to inspire and help people who are self-motivated to almost lead themselves?
I'm very, very fortunate to have an incredible community behind Monero. I don't really need to inspire anyone. A lot of the people, in fact, I would say all the people that work on Monero do so because they believe in Monero and they believe in privacy as a human right. And so they're very, I guess, ideologically motivated. So it thankfully doesn't require much from me. But yeah, I mean, like it can be difficult, and it can be, I think it can be demotivating, especially to new contributors, to pitch up and want to work on an open source project, only to find out that the requirements are extremely stringent. You submit a pull request, it gets rejected because you broke Windows support, or you submit a pull request and it gets rejected because you don't have unit tests. And with Monero, the approach that we've taken is to try and be a little bit softer, and to say like, okay, you broke the Windows build, no problem. We're going to merge it anyway. Someone else is going to come along and fix it, because someone else that needs it to work on Windows will come and fix it. And that's worked out pretty well for us thus far. And the same goes for like when a contributor submits something that doesn't have tests. It's there could be a new contributor who is unfamiliar with our testing framework, who doesn't understand how our tests are put together. And now if you start to browbeat them and be like, oh, well, your contribution is awful because it doesn't have tests, then that's not a great experience for a contributor. So trying to do things in a way that is encompassing and inviting to contributors, I think, has been very important. And that's just a cultural thing. We've just always had that in like from a culture perspective. And it's something that we just continuously encourage, and new people that come are given that culture and brought into that culture, so they adopt it as well.
Very nice. Thank you for that. Okay, so let's take a few audience questions. So we've got a question here from Jason with a number one question with 19 upvotes, which is, it is known that a large part of the popularity of Monero is its privacy. With that privacy comes illegal activity. As developers and supporters of blockchain, how can we provide privacy and still fulfill a moral obligation to not support illegal activity?
This is of course a difficult question that every developer needs to consider themselves. I think for the most part, it's you have to divorce yourself from the way something is used versus the way you'd like it to be used, because anything can be abused. I mean, like so many things can be used for criminal and are used for criminal activity, but they're not designed for that. Kitchen knives can be used in murders. Now, if you've designed a beautiful set of kitchen knives, do you sit and obsess over the fact that they can be used in murders? I doubt very many kitchen knife designers are doing that. And so you have to sort of separate yourself from that and say, my main focus is on building something that is privacy preserving to help people that are disenfranchised, to help people that are desperately in need of it. So I like to think of all the positive examples, people that live in oppressive regimes, where the difference between using something that is privacy preserving or using something that isn't privacy preserving can be life or death for them. So those are the things that I think about when I build or focus on Monero and I build things and so on. Those are the people that I'm trying to help. Certainly not somebody who wants to use it for whatever, cheating someone else or scamming someone or whatever. I mean, that's not something I have control over. And people are going to use it for ransomware and malware. But I mean, that's not something that I can influence. What I can do, though, is continue to provide or work on software that tries to provide maximal privacy for the disenfranchised.
That's a great answer. Thank you. We've got kind of a fun question from JV, which is, where does the nickname Fluffy Pony come from? I'm sure you get this question all the time.
I do. So many years ago, in one of my first jobs in IT, there were two girls in the sales department, Fluffy Puppy and Fluffy Bunny, and they gave me the nickname Fluffy Pony. And initially it was like a bit of a joke, and it just stuck, and I kind of just embraced it. And I was like, okay, this is my nickname now.
I have a weird nickname too. So my name is Ed Roman, but if you put the first two letters of my first name and last name together, it's Edro, E-D-R-O. And when I was young and I logged into websites and games and stuff like that, I didn't understand the idea of a nickname or pseudonym. And so I just used my real name, Ed Roman, all one word. And when people saw that word Ed Roman, they thought it was Ed Roman, like not Ed Roman. And they started, by nickname, they started calling me Edro for some reason. And then it just stuck with me. And so my friends call me that. It's crazy. So you don't actually have an affinity for ponies or anything like that? Nothing like that. All right, great.
No, it was given to me, and I've had to embrace it.
That's awesome. Love it. Okay, so here's a question from Tim Miltz, which is, I noticed some nations are obstructing cryptocurrency solutions that promote anonymous transactions. Could that inhibit the adoption of Monero?
One of my deepest concerns, not deepest concerns, I guess, but one of the deepest risks to Monero is just a general apathy towards privacy. And I kind of, I mean, no one wants people to suffer, but unfortunately, people tend to largely ignore the need for privacy until they get hacked. Or, the credit card provider or Netflix or whoever gets hacked, and now the information's all over the internet, and then they're like, well, wouldn't it be great if we all had privacy-preserving systems? But then it's too late. So I kind of think as these things start to happen more and more, it will hopefully convince people that the privacy is a very, very important thing. And it will convince people to use privacy-preserving systems over systems that disregard their privacy. But ultimately, that might not be the case. And we might find that general apathy is the thing that kills projects like Monero rather than any government intervention. So these are certainly risks, but ultimately, let me put it this way: if privacy is something that people start to really understand they need, then it won't just be the man on the street that's using Monero. It will be regulators that are using Monero as well to preserve their own privacy. And they're certainly not going to pass laws that put their privacy at risk.
Makes sense. All right, so audience, we'll come back to your questions in just a second here. But we actually polled the audience to ask you some questions before this session started. And one of the things that Fluffy Pony was wondering was, are you working at a company using the blockchain? You can answer this right now at the bottom of your screen if you click the polls button. And that's actually a surprisingly higher number than I thought. We have about 17% of the audience that is actually working at a company that is actively using the blockchain today, which is actually pretty impressive, given that blockchain technologies are fairly new in terms of adoption at enterprises as well as even medium-sized corporations. I assume some of you are working at startups, which is great. And then, do you own any Monero? We've got about 15% of the audience that is actually a believer and holds Monero right now. So that's great to hear. Hopefully, there's not too many miners in the audience that have too much control. Speaking of which, by the way, is that a concern that you have?
People who mine.
Sorry, what was that?
Miners, do you mean underage people or people who mine?
Oh, people who mine. I was
people watching this podcast. Welcome, young contributors.
We had a 13-year-old on here yesterday that wanted to learn how to program on the blockchain. It was very inspiring, from India actually. So that's great. Actually, on the subject of miners, I kind of want to ask you. So you used to do mining yourself for Monero, and I'm sure as you've noticed, miners have gotten more and more power these days through ASICs and other technologies like that. Does that concern you at all in terms of kind of the power shift that's happening right now in the cryptocurrency world? And maybe you could help the audience understand a little bit of the differences between GPUs and ASICs and how that all works and what the trend is right there.
I mean, I find ASICs in their current form kind of concerning, just because of the massive amount of clustering that is happening around companies like Bitmain, and that's kind of disconcerting. I also think that there are other aspects to the mining centralization issue. Somebody pointed out the other day that in Venezuela, for example, a lot of the cryptocurrency acquisition happens because people in Venezuela mine, and then they're able to sell to people in Venezuela. The issue, of course, is that they can't really import ASICs, but they can go to the computer shop in the corner and buy a GPU. So on a reasonably large scale, there are individuals who are mining cryptocurrencies. But if they are prevented from mining cryptocurrencies because they're forced to buy ASICs, then we're effectively just blocking access to the technology. Because in that environment, acquiring cryptocurrency is so incredibly difficult. They can't move their devalued money offshore to go and buy cryptocurrency. They can't import ASICs, and so they're stuck with buying from local miners who have to mine using GPUs. So I think that as a relatively small cryptocurrency in the grand scheme of things, Monero is playing its part in terms of giving people access in places like Venezuela. That doesn't mean that we can be GPU only forever, but we will definitely. I think the community's already indicated that they are going to take an anti-ASIC stance for a long time, for as long as possible, until ASICs are just so prevalent and so commoditized that people in Venezuela can go around to the computer shop in the corner and get an ASIC.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And for the audience, in case you guys aren't up to speed, an ASIC is basically a specific piece of hardware that accomplishes a very specific task, and it's programmed to just do that task. And it's kind of an evolution of Moore's law, because CPUs and GPUs have kind of reached a threshold. And so now there are these custom chips being built for specific purposes, like mining cryptocurrency. And so what kind of measures can you take to protect yourselves from from miners who buy these expensive ASICs? Is it in the design of Monero? Can you architect things such that it's not ASIC friendly?
The proof of work algorithm has to be designed in such a way that it is anti-ASIC. But that really only lasts for a period of time, especially for a cryptocurrency like Monero. Any change we make to the algorithm, if there is a highly motivated ASIC manufacturer, they can spin a new ASIC up within 6 months. So we have to sort of commit as a community to constantly changing the algorithm such that there's just no way for an ASIC manufacturer to catch up. And that's kind of the stance that the community's taken, which is it's a difficult thing, but because we have because the community generally takes this approach, it's a lot easier. You know, if there was like a centralized cabal that was trying to push it, I would think it would be a lot harder.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, back in the 90s, there were these rumors that the antivirus software companies, the guys who provided the shields for viruses, would actually be secretly releasing new viruses into the world to cause people to upgrade and to buy the new antivirus software each year. And this is before it was a subscription model for virus scanning. So I wonder if we'll ever be in a world where the manufacturers of ASICs will actually help cause algorithmic changes in cryptocurrencies that people buy new ASICs to mine that cryptocurrency. I mean, it's unfathomable what could happen. Yeah.
It's entirely possible. I mean, like when you look at the size of companies like Bitmain, you know, I mean, for them to infiltrate a smaller cryptocurrency and get them to switch to an algorithm that Bitmain has already designed an ASIC for, probably not that difficult.
I agree. Great. So let's talk about your new project. So you have recently launched a new initiative called Tari, Tari, and I'm sure the audience would love to learn more about what it's all about. So maybe you can give us the backstory as to why you created it and what the vision is for Tari.
So myself and my two other co-founders, Dan Tari and Naveen Jain, we came up with the idea of using or really building a decentralized assets protocol that is significantly better than anything that's out there today. We looked at a bunch of things, like obviously Ethereum's got ERC20 and so on as a standard. And then Colored Coins, of course, was a very old decentralized assets protocol that was used on Bitcoin. And then a few years ago, there was Counterparty that was introduced. Counterparty is a project that we have incredible amounts of respect for. And one of the first ideas we had was to port Counterparty to Monero and then sort of add features to it. But that ended up ultimately being too much effort to make it worthwhile. But we're heavily inspired by the amazing work that's been done on Counterparty. So in some ways, Tari is kind of like Counterparty 2.0 for Monero. You know, we're trying to do things that are very much in the spirit of Counterparty in many ways. But we want to design we are designing things that we think have a lot more scalability than Counterparty's embedded consensus model. And that's kind of where we're, you know, the inspiration for it. We believe that natively digital assets are an important part of this ecosystem right now and will become even more important in future. And natively digital assets are things like in-game assets, in-game currencies, loyalty points, tickets, virtual goods. These are all things that are natively digital. And that's something an assets focused protocol like Tari will be able to provide a robust and scalable infrastructure for anyone that's building an app or a game or whatever that has a natively digital asset.
Very cool. And what's the time frame to release this so that our audience can take advantage of it?
We're building. I mean, it's an open source project, and we're just getting off the ground now. We have an incubator in South Africa that we've set up, and a lot of contributors are being put into this incubator in South Africa to work on the project. But ultimately, it's an open source project, and it's going to take kind of as long as it takes. But yeah, realistically speaking, we're probably like 2 years away from launch.
I see. Okay. And how would the vision for Tari compare to Ethereum, for example?
Ethereum is trying to be like the world computer, and they're trying to boil the ocean. Tari is a lot more focused on just being able to issue assets and work with assets, whether it is transferring or somebody purchasing an asset from someone else or anything like that. So it's extremely focused, which gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of what functionality we can provide. But the aim is obviously to provide incredible functionality that just doesn't exist. For example, being able to issue an asset and as part of the properties for that asset dictate whether all future use of that asset should be maximally private or not, or whether maybe just the amount should be obscured, but the traceability in the system shouldn't. So there's a lot of really interesting pieces of functionality we can provide that we can do in a far more robust and scalable way than on another system that's trying to boil the ocean.
I see. So it's almost like the idea of if you focus on a specific use case, you can build out specific features and functionality that adds value to that use case and reduce the time to market for an engineer who's looking to build within those use cases, essentially. Great. And so are you going to keep working on Monero going forward, or are you going to try to juggle that with Tari? And going forward, what is the relationship going to be between Monero and Tari?
So I'll still continue. I'll never stop working on Monero. And the relationship between Monero and Tari is one where basically Tari relies on Monero's existence. And so we're going to do everything in our power as Tari, the project, to make sure that we continue to support Monero. So being able to leverage the resources that we have access to within the Tari ecosystem and sort of funnel that back down to Monero is massively important to us, whether that is contributing to crowdfunding proposals, literally employing developers to work on Monero, or provide other parts of the Monero ecosystem that are currently lacking. These are all things that Tari is going to be bringing to the table for Monero in the long term.
Very nice.
And
go ahead.
I was going to say my focus is always going to be on Tari right now whilst we're building, but I'm never going to stop working on Monero.
That's great. And in terms of governance for Tari, do you see that playing out in a similar way that you've done it for Monero, where it would be a little bit more loosey-goosey with trusted contributors?
Yeah, so I think we're going to end up with something that's very similar. It's worked well for Monero, so there's no reason for us to go and reinvent the wheel. There will definitely be, I think that as an organization, Tari Labs will be able to provide a lot of infrastructure that can trickle down to Monero as well. So that's kind of cool. But ultimately, it's just about providing the resources for people and letting them build what they can.
Very nice. And so you're tuning in today from South Africa, and that's an ecosystem that most of the audience likely has not had exposure to. So maybe you could kind of fill us into what it's like there. So as a developer in South Africa, is there a robust ecosystem there? What's it like to live there? How has it changed over the last few years? And how do you see it evolving in the future?
South Africa is an amazing place to live. There are trade-offs no matter where you live. But what I will say about South Africa is, we have good parts and bad parts. There are areas that you don't go to, like there are in pretty much every major city in the world. We have an amazing lack of tornadoes, a lack of terrorist attacks, a lack of hurricanes, and a lack of floods, and a lack of earthquakes. So, we basically don't have snow. So it's from my perspective, it's like, in terms of trade-offs, I'll take all of those trade-offs over all the other ones. And it really is just a beautiful and phenomenal place to live. In terms of infrastructure, there are some amazing developers here. Amazon's AWS was invented in South Africa, and there's still an AWS center in Cape Town, where a lot of the tooling is developed. So I think that South Africa as a hub of innovation. Sure, it's still in its infancy in many ways, but there's just massive amounts of untapped talent and untapped potential here.
Very nice. Wow. And I heard that Andela is in the African region as well, who's kind of helping to educate developers in Africa. And so I've seen a number of initiatives like that in Africa. How can we evolve the South Africa and general Africa population to become an even larger, more burgeoning developer ecosystem? Are there any steps that we could be taking to grow the community and to cause entrepreneurship and engineering to be even more widespread in that region?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest problems is just identifying young developers and getting hardware into their hands. I speak to people that work in this industry, and some of them are like, well, the first time I touched a computer was when I was 22. And it blows my mind because hardware is not expensive. And if there's an aptitude, like at an early age, they should be given access to the tools that they need to be able to play with these things, to be able to discover the joy of programming or whatever, just playing around with the tech and breaking things and knowing that it's okay to break something because it can be repaired. There's just incredible value to that. And I think that's really where the focus should be.
That's great. I love it. I think there's huge potential in the region. In fact, in the United States, there's a lack of developer talent, and developers are very expensive. And so I think there's a huge opportunity there to collaborate with Africa in that regard. And that's the beauty of blockchain and open source, is that you have geographically distributed teams where it doesn't really matter what your background is, what your walk of life is, what your socioeconomic status is. You can still be a contributor from anywhere around the world. And we haven't really had that situation historically in the world. And now we have that thanks to open source. That's great. So let's take a few questions from the audience. So let's see. How can I find yesterday's video? I'll answer that one. So it's all on Crowdcast. You can just click at the top of your screen and go through the different sessions historically. Let's see here. How would non-developers contribute to the crypto revolution? This is kind of an interesting question. So I guess there's a few non-developers in the audience. How can they add value and make a difference in blockchain?
Tons of opportunities for non-developers. There's content creation and just sort of like helping people and answering questions on Reddit. And none of that requires you to be a developer, but it does require you to like become familiar with some of the concepts and to actually use the tools and other things. Testing is such a huge thing. When there's a new release, there are nightly binaries of Monero, and when there's a call for testers, then a lot of the people that test the software and provide feedback are completely like not at all developers. They're just ordinary people who have various levels of technical expertise, but they're able to download the software, run it on their machine, and then say, well, it worked or it didn't, and provide that feedback.
Very nice, thank you. And on that same subject, I'll ask another question to riff on that, which is, within a lot of organizations, you'll have semi-technical folks that are in managing and leadership roles, and you'll have the hardcore developers who are kind of doing the day-to-day work. And oftentimes there's pressure for those developers to be promoted and to become managers and to become leaders, because that is their career advancement track within their companies. And I'm sure within our audience, we've got a lot of engineers who are in that situation. But a lot of developers resist that. They don't necessarily want to become a manager or a leader. Is that healthy? And do you think that developers should be embracing the potential of becoming an engineering leader? Or is it healthy to just remain a developer and be happy in that role and be okay with maybe your limited career advancement opportunities?
You have to advance from being a developer to managing developers is crazy. I think that you can be, you can have a career as a developer and progress to, being an architect and really focusing on how the software is put together and how it's designed. And that's like, if that's the ceiling for you, then so what? I mean, if you're an engineer that works on bridges, do you have to end up leading a team of engineers that works on bridges? Or can you just be a very, very excellent structural engineer with a very specific focus on bridges? I think that's completely fine.
I agree with you. It's like one last question from the audience, from Alexander Ryman. Are there any plans to change consensus types of Monero from proof of work to something else?
that personally and as a community, we're very open to things. But right now, the only robust consensus system that we have that has proven for nearly a decade of actual production with Bitcoin is Nakamoto consensus with proof of work.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. Well, thank you, Riccardo. We really enjoyed hearing from you today. You've been very, very helpful to the audience. We're grateful. We know how busy your schedule is. And so thanks again for all of your time today. And good luck with both Tari and Monero. And audience, we'll be back in just a few minutes with the leader of Basis, which is a brand new algorithmically banked stablecoin. So be here and we'll come right back. Thanks again, Riccardo.